A major debate over World War II, controversial to this day, concerns the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The issue in question was Britain's policy of attacking German cities by night. U.S. policy was to concentrate attacks on specific military and industrial targets by day. Area bombing, or city busting as it was called, was designed to break the morale of the German people and force the surrender of Nazi Germany. It was based on a popular pre-war theory that argued that wholesale bombing attacks would enable nations to achieve ultimate victory without resorting to costly ground campaigns. With this in mind, the RAF Bomber Command launched 3 major bombing attacks on Germany in 1943. The last was a sustained assault on the German capital of Berlin. Like previous RAF attacks, the bombing of Berlin caused considerable damage. But the German people endured. There was no marked weakening of morale. As a result, the Allies were forced to fight a long and costly ground campaign. Germany did not surrender until Soviet troops took Berlin after a bitter 2-week battle. Britain had successfully endured a similar campaign, the Luftwaffe's bombing offensive against London and other British cities during the winter of 1940 and 1941. There was no reason to think air bombing would work any better against the Germans. From early 1942 until the end of the war in Europe, Sir Arthur Harris was head of the RAF Bomber Command. He believed in the theory of air power, which was developed just after the end of World War I, notably by Italian General Giulio Douhet. Douhet was inspired by the strategic bombing offensives of 1914 through 1918, especially those by German airships and aircraft against Britain. Douhet and others argued that bombing on its own could win wars. It could pinpoint the enemy's seat of government, industry, and the morale of its people. The RAF's Harris set out to prove this theory. Before Harris took over command of the strategic bombing offensive, the RAF struggled with too many severe disadvantages to prove air theorists right. First, the RAF Bomber Command did not have enough heavy bombers to mount a sustained, powerful offensive on Germany. Second, RAF bombers were forced to operate by night. They did not have long-range escort fighters, nor the defensive armament to repel German day fighters. At the time, night operations made accurate navigation and bombing difficult to achieve. Third, the Germans had built up comprehensive belts of defenses using radar, searchlights, and flak guns. Known as the Kammhuber Line, after the Luftwaffe general who set up these anti-aircraft belts, they protected the lanes British bombers would use to approach Germany. The Germans also had an increasingly effective night fighting force. This made it doubtful that the RAF Bomber Command could contribute to the war against Germany. Soon after Harris took command in February 1942, he received 2 new pieces of equipment. The first was a new navigation system called G. G could pinpoint an aircraft's position using a specially gridded map combined with radio transmissions from ground stations. It radically improved a bomber crew's chances of finding its target at night. Harris was also given a new bomber, the Avro Lancaster. The Lancaster could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs over 1,600 miles. It would prove to be one of the outstanding bombers of the war. With enough of these airplanes, Harris believed he could prove the bomber school of air theory right and win the war. To get Churchill and his war cabinet to provide him with the aircraft he needed, Harris decided to stage a spectacular demonstration. He borrowed planes from wherever he could and mounted 3 1,000 bomber raids against German targets in the early summer of 1942. The 1,000 bomber raids were a remarkable achievement and impressed the British government. But it was impossible to increase the production of bombers overnight. It was some time before the strength of Harris's frontline bombers was sufficient and his ideas could be put into action. In 1943, Harris began to receive the quantity of heavy bombers he needed to launch a sustained attack on Germany. In January of that year, he was given official backing by Churchill and Roosevelt at their Casablanca Strategic Conference. They agreed that bombing Germany to fatally weaken her ability to wage war was an essential prerequisite to Allied re-entry to Europe. The decision appeared to reflect an acceptance of Harris's bombing strategy. U.S. bombers attacked by day. RAF Bomber Command would continue its offensive by night. The crews would concentrate on area bombing, or city busting. This had 2 objectives. First, it would disrupt German industry by bombing workers out of their homes and causing absenteeism. Second, and even more ruthless, the offensive was meant to totally demoralize the German people by inflicting widespread devastation and casualties. During 1943, Harris would wage 3 distinct battles against German urban areas. He warned the German people,
"They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind."
Harris's attacks culminated with World War II's toughest and most severe test of the RAF. But the plan did not destroy the German people's will to fight. Harris would overreach himself in what became one of the most controversial blunders of the war. The first of Sir Arthur Harris's major bombing attacks against Germany began in March 1943. The target was Western Germany's main industrial area, the Ruhr. Harris maintained the campaign for 4 months. During that period, he mounted 43 major raids against German targets. 2/3 were against the Ruhr itself. The remainder were designed to prevent the Luftwaffe from concentrating its night fighter force in the Ruhr. Harris claimed to have extensively damaged German industry, but the campaign had little effect on Hitler's war machine. Munitions production increased during 1943. Moreover, the German night fighting force became increasingly effective, despite Harris's efforts to disperse it. It was soon shooting down more aircraft than German flak guns. During the last month of the battle, German night fighters were so effective that availability of British bombers and crews fell by 15%. These growing losses forced Harris to stop the battle in early July. Despite his bomber casualties, Harris turned to another target within 2 weeks, Germany's northern port city of Hamburg. Facing 4 RAF raids by night and 2 by the U.S. 8th Air Force by day, the heart of Hamburg was torn out. At least 45,000 inhabitants perished, many in firestorms created by the heavy use of incendiary bombs. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. But among the German people, the bombing led to as much anger as it did shock. The determination to fight on remained strong. Doubts began to surface that sustained bombing alone could achieve victory. During the attacks on Hamburg, the RAF Bomber Command introduced a new weapon, window. It used strips of aluminum foil cut to a certain size. Dropped by bombers, these confused German radar. German night fighter controllers were blinded by window, and bomber losses fell significantly. But the Germans quickly revised their tactics. Night fighters began to roam freely rather than being tightly controlled from the ground. This made them even more effective than before window. The quick adaptation was another indication that German resistance was as strong as ever. Harris thought differently. Mistakenly encouraged by the successful assault on Hamburg, Harris turned to another target. He believed the destruction of the German capital of Berlin would bring the war to a speedy end. Toward the end of August 1943, the RAF Bomber Command conducted a dress rehearsal. 3 attacks were made against Berlin, but out of nearly 1,650 heavy bombers, 126 were shot down. This represented a loss rate of 7.7%, unacceptably high. It demonstrated that German air defenses made a remarkable recovery from the damage inflicted on them by window. It should have been a warning to Harris that waging a campaign against the very heart of Germany could be a costly blunder. But he was only prepared to delay the opening of the main assault until the onset of winter, when the nights became longer. Harris had other reasons to delay the launch of his offensive against Berlin. He wanted to wait until all his bombers had been equipped with new electronic aids. One was a new navigation device, H-2S, called Home Sweet Home by the crews. This was a radar that looked downward and scanned the terrain the aircraft flew over. It was very effective over terrain with clear natural features like coastlines and large rivers. It made the navigator's job considerably easier. But H-2S did not work well over a large urban sprawl like Berlin. Harris hoped that the U.S. 8th Air Force would join his offensive against the German capital. But the U.S. Air Force was still recovering from its first really deep penetration mission into Germany, against ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt and a fighter factory at Regensburg. Unescorted U.S. bombers had been badly mauled by German day fighters. More heavy casualties were sustained in the attack on Schweinfurt in October. This and the need to transfer U.S. bombers to Italy meant that the 8th Air Force was not ready to attack Berlin. The RAF's Harris was impatient to begin his offensive. He decided to go it alone to prove his point that bombing could win wars. He began his main assault on Berlin on the night of November 18, 1943. It was an encouraging start. Only 9 of 444 bombers failed to return. But hopes that British bombers could achieve a major victory over the Third Reich would soon be dashed. Worsening weather and stronger German air defenses would increase the bomber loss rate, not weaken German morale. The extent of Harris's miscalculation would soon be revealed. The British mounted 7 more attacks against Berlin before the end of 1943. But visibility worsened. Combined with more effective German night fighter tactics, this pushed the British casualty rate higher. The strain on the British bomber crews began to tell. Many became fatalistic about their chances of survival. They had to fly 30 missions before they completed their operational tours and received a rest from combat flying. But Harris remained undeterred. In January 1944, in even more adverse weather conditions, Harris launched 5 more attacks on Berlin. The bomber loss rate rose to over 6% of the aircraft involved. Berlin suffered enormous damage, but the city was twice the size of Hamburg and could better absorb the destruction. Berliners endured the bombing with the same stoicism Londoners had during the Blitz 3 years earlier. The innate discipline of the German people and the rigid grip of the Nazi regime helped ensure the preservation of morale. During the first half of February 1944, the weather was so terrible that no attacks could be launched on Berlin. When British bombers returned to Berlin on the night of February 15th, they lost 42 out of 891 bombers. It would be 5 weeks before RAF bombers would make another attack. This time, over 9% failed to return. Sir Arthur Harris was finally forced to accept that Berlin was too difficult a target. He had been unable to prove that area bombing could win a war. At the end of March, General Dwight Eisenhower reassigned Allied strategic bombing forces in Britain. They would provide direct support for the landings in Normandy. Before Eisenhower took control, Harris carried out one more major attack against a German city, Nuremberg. On the night of March 30th, 1944, at least 106 out of 782 bombers were shot down. It was the RAF Bomber Command's worst casualty rate in all its major raids of World War II. Harris had tried to win the war on his own, but blundered. In his determination to prove the bombing theorists right, he refused to acknowledge until it was too late that the RAF Bomber Command was paying a heavy price in plane and crew losses. He overlooked the fact that London itself had survived a sustained German air assault. Between September and November 1940, there was only one night when the German bombers were not over the British capital. The German Blitz lasted for 8 long months, but did not break the British spirit. Against this backdrop, there was no reason to believe that Berliners would react any differently to the British bombing their city. The bombing did not break the morale of the German people. The war continued for another year. London and Berlin both proved that the theory of city busting on its own could not win wars. But if Harris had mounted a sustained campaign against German communications and oil, as the American air commanders had wanted, the resulting destruction would have stopped Germany much earlier. When the Allies did use this tactic, Germany began to collapse, bringing the war to an end.